to the Ask Historians podcast.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson, and today I am with fellow moderator HannahStoHelit. And Hannah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. This is a very cool thing to be doing.
Yeah, it's fun to have you on. We are going to be talking about something that I think a lot of people have probably heard of, including me. I've heard of this thing, but I really don't know anything about it, so I'm going to be asking you a lot. We're talking about golems, and specifically a very famous iteration of that, a very famous story about golems. But what exactly? First of all, I mean, a lot of people will think of Gollum and the Lord of the Rings, which is like not really what we're talking about here.
No,
so, can you just give a background as to what we're talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So Gollum from Lord of the Rings, as far as I'm aware, has no connection whatsoever. I am curious to know, Tyler, what, just because, I come at this I have a 12-year Jewish education and, from K-12 Jewish education, degree in Jewish history. And so I have a certain level, maybe I'll touch on this later, of knowledge about this kind of stuff where sometimes I don't necessarily know what people with a less Jewish, hyper-focused background would know about it, though I do know that it's something that is relatively heard of in some way. So I guess, Tyler, I'm just curious to know, before we talked about it, before, we approached making this episode, what did you know about golems?
Yeah, so as someone who doesn't have a Jewish education at all, besides going to a couple of like bat and bar mitzvahs back in the day, I know that a golem is some kind of sort of like created, not quite human thing, and created out of like mud or clay, and it's kind of anthropomorphized and made into this being that is somehow then controlled, or somehow sort of almost like either a slave master or just kind of not quite as fully human as a person is. And obviously features heavily in Jewish folklore, or at least features in Jewish folklore in some capacity. But that's as far as I get. I would guess that most people would be around that they would know that. Yeah. So first of all, is that broadly correct?
It is. Broadly, I would say yes, though there are definitely some nuances, such as it's funny because it's one of those legends where a lot of the versions that people know are a lot newer than you think, but it actually happens to be, for Jewish quote-unquote folklore legends, it's actually pretty old. A lot of things that there are a lot of different kinds of things that people think are old Jewish folklore that are extremely recent. So relatively speaking, this one's actually pretty old. Something that I think people have heard of, and that a sort of a further version, I think, is there's a version where he was owned by a famous rabbi in Prague. People associate the golem with Prague, in particular, the city, and different things like that. That's much more modern, for example. But yes, so I would say, broadly speaking, it's definitely one of those things where, for example, on the Ask Historians sub, there was at one point someone asked a question saying, okay, so I know the famous story of the Golem of Prague and how it helped to avert the blood libel from the Jews of Prague in the 15-something or others. I know that that couldn't have happened because there's no such thing as golems, but what actually happened in Prague and how was it averted? So I had the privilege of being like, just so you know, the only part of that actually is historically founded in that particular time period, sort of, is the part about golems. Literally none of that happened in Prague. So it was entirely made up by a rabbi named Yudel Rosenberg in 1909. So it's definitely something where there are a lot of different versions of it. It also has made its way into, I think, particularly in the last, several decades, into different kinds of sci-fi fantasy pop culture. I know one of my favorite versions of it is in Discworld. As anyone who knows Discworld from my username, you can tell I'm a big fan. And there's a great book, Feet of Clay, though they also come up in a few later books, but I think they're based more on some other version of golems that's less based on Jewish folklore. But in Feet of Clay, he does a fantastic version of Golems. I think draws on a few different versions of the legend over time, or a few different like iterations of it. And I think also, and I'm happy to discuss this a little later to a certain degree, but there are certain conceptions about golems in terms of there being rescue figures or different things like that, where that's something also that is very modern and even led people believe, and this is backed up by certain things that several comics writers have alluded to, in terms of golems having that rescue aspect of golems actually having an influence on the development of superheroes in the comics, going way back to the early Superman comics of the 30s, 40s kind of era, with many of which were made by Jewish young men of that era who are in the shadow of Nazi Germany, seeing what was going on across the Atlantic Ocean. So while, again, those are all referring to a shockingly, modern, the story that they may have been referring to mentally was only about 30 years old at that point. But even so, it's something that, whether it's just as a more amorphous kind of an idea of like a creature that could be created by humans and controlled, or whether it has a specific version of the story in which it's being used for good and to save the Jewish people or to save humanity or whatever, all of these are sort of parts of a bigger story of like what golems are that develops a lot over the course of really centuries, if not, more than a millennium. So it's actually a pretty cool story in terms of how that happens.
Right. So, I mean, I guess as we get started a little bit, I'd love to know the kind of the origins of that. And I guess we can start there and just go back to what are some of our earliest sort of known golems out there, and how, again, with this idea of something made out of mud, kind of controlled by someone not quite human, how close are we in those early iterations to the popular view of a golem?
Yeah, absolutely. So happens to be in a certain sense, you could say that Adam of Adam and Eve fame was the first golem. It's actually not even that big of a stretch, because it's actually alluded to in the Talmud later on, where, Adam is created out of earth, and God creates him and turns him into a living being. The difference with Adam is that he was given the power of speech, and you'll see it comes up a lot in later versions of the golem stories. You'll rarely see a version of a golem which can talk, and that actually in Discworld that becomes a big thing, which is one of the things that I enjoy about his adaptation, about his version. But what you'll rarely ever see is a golem that can talk. Sometimes you'll see a golem that can write, but you'll rarely, if ever, see one who can talk. And so in the Talmud, we actually see it's a rabbi called Rava, and he it just says Rava bara Adam. Rava created a man. And what we then realize, then there's commentaries, and they sort of discuss how he did this using holy names and mysticism to turn mud and dirt into a human. And one thing that, yes, go ahead.
And just for anyone not familiar as much with the chronology of the Talmud or anything, what when around are we talking in terms of when this is written?
Probably about 300, 400. There's probably a more accurate. We're thinking sometime between in the first several centuries of the current Common Era. I don't remember exactly when he lived. So this is the kind of thing that Talmud is full of, a lot of stories, some of which can straightforward, and some of which are very mystical. And so they're interpreted in lots of different ways. Sometimes it depends on by whom, but this is one of those stories that is clearly very mystical. And so Rava creates this man out of earth, and he sends it to his friend Reb Zera, who is elsewhere in the city in Babylonia. And Zera meets him. He looks totally normal, and that's another thing that a lot of people, when they think of golems, they think of big hulking clay things. There's one version, and I'll talk about later, that is like that. But most versions actually have golems. They're created out of dirt, and they look human. Sometimes they even are vulnerable like humans. There's one version where the story has the golem bleeding after being injured. So most versions of golems, in the older versions, actually have them just turning dirt into people. And so that's really, kind of similar to the thing with, Adam in terms of being the first golem. And it's interesting because this golem shows up and he goes to Rosera, and Rosera thinks he's a real person until he asks the golem a question, and the golem does not respond. He realizes that it can't talk. And so once the golem can't talk, Rosera says, "You cannot talk. It means, you're clearly not a person. Let's return you to the earth from which you came." And he does something that causes the golem to turn back into a pile of dirt. So this is really the first story of an actual golem. I don't believe it's called a golem in that story, but it's a creature made of dirt that is controlled by a human master, and that, or not even necessarily controlled, but created and, given the power of a certain limited kind of life. But it's really missing that one thing that differentiates it from being a person, which is that power of speech. Because that is, then the word golem actually, it comes from Psalms in the Bible, and golem, which means mute. So this is something that's very intrinsically part of the idea of golem mythology. It might be created and given this power of life and being able to do things, but because it doesn't have that power of speech, it's not its own person in that way. So that's a very important part of golem stories. Then there's another one, before it gets like big ones that actually influence the way people look at golems today. There's one smaller one that I'll mention, which is there's a rabbi in medieval Spain, early medieval Spain, I think like the 11th century, named Solomon Ibn Gabirol, and he is said to have created a golem out of wood. This is the only one out of wood I've ever heard of, just as a maidservant to do his chores, using mysticism. And then somebody accused him of using it for immoral purposes, and so he destroyed it because he was horrified at this, aspersion cast upon him. So that's one relatively small version of a golem story, but it's the first one that I've ever heard of that discusses golems being used by people to do things for them. And later on, that becomes a very recurring theme of golems coming up in different kinds of stories that become popular. And at that same time, there are lots of different things happening in, Kabbalah or mysticism, where they're talking about how to make golems. Like, making a golem is a known quantity. It is a thing you can do, and here are the codes that you use and the heavenly names that you use in the process. And you can even look at books today that will show you formulas for how to make golems. They're very complicated. I have no idea how they work. I've tried to read them. They make no sense to me.
You've never tried to make one yourself?
I had a mysticism module in a class that I took in grad school, and it was the most complicated, annoying thing I've ever tried to do. And so it is all out there. Everyone is welcome to try it if they is the way that I would put it. So, yeah, that is basically the sort of prehistory of golems, if that makes sense.
So I wanted to ask you in a kind of a, and I don't want to get into kind of the too deep into the theological weeds and all that, but is it generally seen as a sort of a good or a bad thing or a neutral thing to make a golem? Because I can see it as, you're talking about Adam. It's like you are kind of playing God in a way. Is there a connotation attached to it, or is it just something that, hey, sometimes people do this? This guy down in Spain, he did this thing.
Yeah, so it's obviously a really interesting question. And it comes up a little bit later, because later, once you have some stories that are written, for a purpose, where a story like, the story of Rava and Rosera, I don't know what the purpose was of including it in the Talmud, but it's not really written in a way that's, moralizing. It's just saying this is a thing that happened, and it's part of a conversation about a person's, it's about spiritual powers and a person's ability to create things with certain, spiritual patterns. The next part of the Talmud passage says that there were rabbis who sat the eve of every Sabbath, and they would create a cow that they would eat in honor of the Sabbath. So this is really just more about mysticism in general and the kinds of mystical abilities that these rabbis are written as having. And so in most cases, they're not really ascribing what it really ascribes is power, and it's not just power of the rabbis as them, though it is to a certain degree. It's, them channeling the mysticism and the powers, of God and different things like that from that perspective. But it's really sort of attempting to portray these. It's more about the creators having and wielding a power in that regard, and then using it in different ways, seeing through it in different ways. And also, as Reverend Isaiah said, the limitations of that power. He could maybe those other rabbis could make a cow that they could eat and it would be delicious. That's fine. But a person can't make a person who, out of dirt, who will be able to act like a normal person in terms of being able to speak. And it's not just, the power of speech in this case. Later we get into the difference, some stories where a golem can write but can't speak. But here it's just the ability of communication in general, which is seen as that sign of, innate human life. And so that's one of those things we're saying, these are great rabbis. I think that's one important connotation. These are people who have clearly learned and who are able to do all kinds of things. One thing they will not be able to do is create a person who can, who is a real person in the way that God can. And so that I think would be, if there's any kind of a moral that's coming up this early, that I think would be it.
Yeah, that contrast between the power of man and the power of something greater than man out there. That's interesting. That's so. We have some of these more, and you said some of the stories were even necessarily before Golem, the name, got attached to this idea. So now we're kind of moving into, I guess, can we call it, Golem classic or something?
Exactly.
The kind of
the very beginning of that, yes.
And what pardon the not quite pun, but what is shaping up here? What is starting to take shape out of that mud? As we go from these sort of pre-golems into the real thing.
No, for sure. So that it's definitely the beginning of that. This is the first time that we see sort of the transition from people just writing down things that happened or to then turning them into stories. So the actual turning them into stories and folktales really actually doesn't happen until the 19th century, but let's first talk about what turns into that, which is later on. So what turns into that is sometime in like the 16th, 17th century. We have a rabbi named Rabbi Jacob Emden, who is a fascinating figure in his own right, who deserves 3 podcast episodes of his own. But we're just going to suffice it to say that he was the great-grandson of a rabbi called the Baal Shem of Chelm. The Baal Shem of Chelm. Baal Shem, those of you who are familiar with Jewish history may have heard of the Baal Shem Tov. He was the founder of the Hasidic movement. The similarities in the name are just because the term Baal Shem sort of meant like a folk healer, mystical figure who was supposed to use, God-given spiritual powers to help the local community. So they were both that kind of local folk healer. And his name was Rabbi Elijah Baal Shem of Chelm. And so this was a man who is said to have made a golem. And this is really this is the only example of a golem story that I've really seen that does have sort of the golem stay in like that clayey, muddy form that I was talking about. Most of the other ones don't. So this one is actually interesting. I don't know whether I should read it in full because it does happen to be. There are 2 versions of it that I know of. One is by a non-Jew named Christoph Arnold. Gershom Shalom in his book Kabbalah cited a translation of it. There's also a separate version from about the same time by Rabbi Jacob Emden. And so both of them were basically similar story. And do you mind should I read it or should I try to paraphrase it?
Maybe a paraphrase would be good, and we can put up a link.
Sure. I would say to put up a link to the original post, but you're going to see there's some stuff in there that's in here that's not in there. Maybe I'll do another write-up. I don't know. Anyway, okay, so I'll paraphrase it regardless. So essentially you have Rabbi Elijah Baal Shem makes a golem, makes it out of clay, and when he has said the Shem HaMeforash over it, this is according to Christoph Arnold, Shem HaMeforash, which is the holy name of God, over it, the image comes to life. And though the image can't speak, so it understands what it has to say to it. And it's used by Rabbi Elijah and the people around for housework, which is similar to what we saw with Solomon and Gabriel. And this is something that became pretty famous in certain later, particularly the sci-fi fantasy versions of the golem occasionally, because it's pretty evocative. On the golem's forehead is written the word emet. I'm actually going to say emet. Do you mind if I just start that again?
Yeah.
I started doing it with like the Israeli translation. That's not how I talk, so I'm going to do it the way I'm used to talking. So do you want to just...
Yeah.
So on the golem's forehead is written the word emes, which is truth. Aleph, Mem, Saf. That's 3 letters. And as long as it says emes, truth, on the forehead, it'll go and do its thing. And in order to get the golem to stop... what you would do, because, this is a golem that it can rage out of control. It's there's a possibility that, it's growing larger every day and it could overpower everyone in the house. In order to get it to stop, you need to erase the letter Aleph at the beginning, and then it just says Mace, which means death or dead. So when Mary Elijah Baal Shem made this golem and it grow larger and larger, one day he decides that it's gotten too large. He wants to get rid of the Aleph and turn it into Mace and turn it dead, and so he tries to do it, and he realizes it's gotten so big that he can't reach it. He can't reach the forehead anymore. So he tricks the golem by saying, "Tie my shoe." The golem bends down to tie his shoe. Suddenly the forehead is at hand level. He erases the Aleph. And here's where the versions of Christoph Arnold and Jacob Emden differ, because Christoph Arnold says that the golem was crouching over Rabbi Elijah and then crushed him to death. And the version by his great-grandson, Jacob Emden, says he was only injured, which is, I guess, a little bit more family-friendly. And so, but what it essentially means is, in this new version of the golem story, golems go out of control. They grow. They are to a certain degree within the form of, something that the person who created it can ask to do things, can make to do things. But even with that, and even without it being a malicious thing where the golem is rebelling against its master, it will just naturally never fully go according to what the master wants. It will grow out of control, and humans aren't meant for that kind of power. So when you were talking earlier about there being a moral of the story, this is where we start to see the moral. One interesting thing I should just mention when we're still talking about this part of the story is, Jacob Emden's father was named Tzvi Ashkenazi, and he, of course, also knew this story of the golem from his grandfather. He talked about him having made it, and he used it as an opening for a question of halacha, or Jewish law, which is, can a golem count in a prayer quorum? So, prayer quorum in Jewish law is that, you need 10 men in order to do a full prayer service. And so this rabbi, Tzvi Ashkenazi, examined the question of whether a golem counts as a person for that purpose. And I haven't read the full thing. I don't know. I don't believe that he said the answer was yes. It's not uncommon in terms of as an absurd hypothetical to kind of interrogate what exactly the laws are. It's one of those things that's actually pretty common, but it's an interesting thing in general, the idea of, someone actually devoting the time to the question of, can a big clay figure made by man be counted in a prayer quorum, but also just in terms of him reflecting on his grandfather, who apparently made one of these things. So that's something that I always find pretty amusing. So this story is less important in its own context of having, been written down by these two people. Or I said 18th century, 19th century earlier in terms of the first time it was really turned into a story, but that's actually, I misspoke. It's really 18th century, because at that point it started to move into folklore. So we see the Brothers Grimm, or rather Jacob Grimm, included a version of the story, but not in the same way. We have fairy tales where he would tell a whole narrative. He really just sort of wrote down a truncated version of what I just said above in one of the collections of stories. It's not really something that, was turned into a long form piece or even, short form, short story.
I was going to say that story is one of the stories I think I had, either the Brothers Grimm, some kind of compendium of folk tales, and that basic plot line that you just laid out sounded very, very familiar. And also kind of put it in my mind that a golem isn't a good thing. That it's a bit of a scary thing. Because again, at least in the context of that story, that's
what's so interesting, because this story and then another one that I'll talk about later are the two main ones, and they have very different messages about what a golem is and what it should mean and different things like that. So it's actually, really something that comes up a lot. And this is the one I think definitely made it into popular culture earlier and spread in a lot of different kinds of ways. And, there are hypotheses, and this, people can say loads of different things inspired people, and there's no proof one way or the other, but there are definitely people who believe that the idea of person making a golem and this kind of, Jacob Grimm story is what inspired Mary Shelley when she was writing Frankenstein. I'm sure she had many inspirations. This may or may not have been one of them, but it's definitely something that was entering the zeitgeist at around that time.
You can see it. Some parallels there. And one of the things that I'm wondering is I'm fascinated by the idea. By two things that you mentioned. One of them is the sort of the speaking of the holy name of God, which I know is that's like a thing in Judaism, that's like something, that is specifically, the name is sort of imbued with a lot of power, to the point that as I understand it, most Jews wouldn't say it. Would use other, I don't know whether the term would be euphemisms, but other sort of words for God. But the second thing that really struck me, that's kind of related to that, was that we're talking in some instances of non-Jews taking these these stories and writing about them, and I wonder. I mean, it's a gross understatement to say that the relationship between non-Jews and Jews has been rocky, for a couple millennia, and I'm just wondering, does that color some of these stories? Some of this negative. Is there anything that say the non-Jewish sources would put into the story that a Jewish source might not, or would take away from the story that a Jewish source might not?
So that's a really interesting question, especially since it really plays into something I was going to discuss later. I don't know how chronological you want to go. I can say it now or do it later.
Yeah, we can save it for a little later.
But it happens to be there's a really interesting... In this particular thing, I'm not sure it makes much of a difference, just because this is a story, or rather a version of a story, that both Jews and non-Jews have been saying. This happens to be a time period where actually a lot of the Jewish quote-unquote literature that you see ends up being sort of taken from, contemporary non-Jewish literature, so there's a lot of different sort of swapping around. And I don't really get the impression that the story was mutating all that much at that point among non-Jews, but it did a lot later on, and so definitely hold on to that thought. This particular story was the one that was most likely to do that, because, as you said, it does have these dark undertones that are very easy to latch onto if you have a creative imagination. So definitely something that happened a little bit later. At this point, Jacob Grimm or any other, I think it was taken up by a bunch of different people at different points, but I don't think it was changed all that much from that perspective, and Jews and non-Jews would be telling pretty similar versions of the story, and that's really what they ended up doing. So versions of the story kept on popping up over the course of the 19th century. So the versions of the story start popping up, and here's one really interesting, because I mentioned earlier that a lot of people associate the golem with Prague, and that's to the point where if you go to Prague today and you decide to do a little bit of Jewish tourism, I know I've thought of doing this myself, anything you see that has to do with Jews in Prague, and the government of Prague has no problem capturing this as well, is associated with the golem. They are obsessed with the golem from a tourism perspective. The Jewish community is genuinely very annoyed about this, because they're going to cover very thoroughly. But the golem of Prague, if it was like, the way I think of it, there are three different ways in which you can look at, was there a golem of Prague? One way is, do you believe it is possible for there to ever be a golem? And that's theological, and then you can go there. Like, could a golem ever exist, right? That's how you think about the world, right? Then there's, have there ever been golems? And that's to a certain extent based on one, or has a particular golem ever existed? And that's to a certain extent based on, the first one, but to a certain extent you can look at historical evidence, and if only one person is saying there was this big mess of hulking clay monster, you can say, okay, you can express your own doubt, or you can say, hey, his grandson said it, maybe he saw, all those different kinds of things. You can approach it in different ways. The third one is, was there a golem of Prague? And you would be very hard pressed to find anybody. There are people, 100%, who will say with certainty that they believe that there was a golem in Prague. But there is very little connective tissue, I guess, between there being between how the golem story got to that point and the previous time period in which they set that story and how it got to be there. So I'll just, I guess, give some background at this point. So first of all, I will say that internet friend of mine was very graciously pointed me towards a few things when I was researching for this, and he's on Twitter as On the Mainline. If you are at all interested in Jewish history, particularly, ephemera, it's a great account to follow. So one thing that he pointed me to is that in the last century of, I'm going to be more precise about this, in 1794, we have somebody named Saul Berlin, who is a very interesting figure. Forgery and plagiarism are going to become kind of themes in this story, and he was actually a pretty well-known plagiarist. But he was also from a very well-known rabbinic family of his time. His brother actually became one of the less distinguished chief rabbis of England. And so this is someone who knew what was going on. He wrote this book of Jewish folklore in 1794. He includes, on the same page, there's a story of a miracle related to this rabbi named Maharal, who I'll talk about in a minute. And then he says there's a separate story of a golem that was made by a rabbi named Rabbi Naphtali, but he never mentions any conception of an idea that Maharal of Prague made a golem. And so if anyone was going to know about it, this guy would likely have known about it. If it was a well-known story, a well-known thing that people were talking about, he would have known about it. So we can set a probable outer boundary in terms of when did this happen, when did this connection happen, about the late 18th century. But after that, we start to get this idea where the idea of a golem, stories about golems, this previous story that we talked about was in Chelm, in Poland. And then suddenly, you get to this idea that Prague, at the time, in the 19th century, Austro-Hungarian Empire, before that, Bohemia and Moravia, and so that was the location of the story of the golem. So let's just first talk about what that meant, because when this started to happen, this was the earliest known version of this that places the story specifically in Prague is in about the 1830s. So they all start to say that instead of this previous version, which was made by this rabbi Elijah of Chelm, or any other version of the story, main stories that pop up are that it was made by this rabbi named Maharal, Rabbi Judah Low of Prague. So to talk a little bit about him, he was a rabbi in Prague as well as several other cities, and he was one of the leading rabbis of this era. If you have a Jewish education, certainly if you had the kind of Jewish education I had, even if you had other kinds of Jewish education, he will possibly come up as well. But if you know anything about rabbis, let's put it that way, throughout history, you will have heard of him. He has works on the Bible, on Jewish law and theology that are still used today. And what's interesting is he was not known as someone who was interested in practical Kabbalah, mysticism and theology. He had a certain level of interest in it, but no one would have ever before this pictured him as the kind of person who would have been interested in creating a golem. And there are some rabbis, as we've sort of discussed, who maybe would have been the kind of people who you would picture having that interest, but really not him. And yet, even so, sometime around the early 19th century, people started to say, oh, well, this golem story was clearly the province of Maharal. So it's by the 1840s, it was really all over literature, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and it was even in a popular Jewish history book where people are including different versions. So the first version is in 1834, and it mentions that there's a golem in the attic of the Maharal's synagogue, the Altneuschel, that was created with Kabbalah, with Jewish mysticism, and instead of being controlled by emes and mace on the top of his head, on top of the golem's head, he was controlled by a weekday paper and a Sabbath paper. So when the weekday paper is put in, the golem does all of his chores, and then before the Sabbath paper is put in, so the golem can kind of calm down. And then there's a story where how they forgot to take out the weekday paper, and then even though it's the Sabbath, and then it kind of ran amok from that perspective, because we've already entered the part in the story where the fact that you can't control the golem fully is going to be a part of stories like this. And so, again, by the 1840s, there were multiple versions of this kind of story. They bring in Maharal is a really important part of it. They bring in the fact that the golem is in the attic of Altneuschel. And part of this is that they say that to this day, when you're writing a version of the story, to this day, as of 1847, the ruins of the golem are in the Altneuschel. And so that turns into all these people saying, ooh, can I go into the attic of the Altneuschel? And you'll still have people now who will want to do that. And, they don't let them in because it's like a 800-year-old synagogue, and they're not just going to let random people in the attic. But there are people who have said over time that they've gone up there and they've seen the ruins, the relics of the golem, which I'm not going to comment on.
So this part of it at least has that kind of folktale feel of you're getting different versions of the story in different ways. Exactly. With a basic, it sounds almost like a Sorcerer's Apprentice concept of you create something and you can mostly control it, but not quite. It kind of runs amok somehow, and then you've got to I'm guessing if you put the wrong newspaper in, you've got to figure out how to get the right newspaper in and all that before it goes crazy.
Yeah, so it's the kind of thing where actually the Sorcerer's Apprentice, so later in the other story, the other version I'll bring up shortly, I think they actually if I remember correctly, I was just rereading it before, I think it actually name drops, the Sorcerer's Apprentice as a comparison in terms of something that would be part of this. I always thought of it as more sort of like, in that story, actually more of like an Amelia Bedelia kind of thing also, where it follows the instructions a little bit too literally, and I'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, so actually I should correct myself a little bit. The version I said earlier, and just from 1834, it was really just stating the facts of the golem. It was really in 1846, there was a writer named Leopold Wiesel, and he's the one who sort of first introduced the Sorcerer's Apprentice kind of motif in terms of forgetting to take the paper out and all that. So while you can argue is a little bit based on the previous one where the golem's just getting larger and larger and larger, that wasn't really based on anything that the person did. Like the golem would do what they wanted it to do in the previous story from Rabbi Elijah Helm, but there was just something about it that just kept on growing and was out of their control. It wasn't really related to the fact that it was doing their chores. Here is really the first time where, if you're not looking out for it, it's not going to do exactly the things that you want it to do. So that's also a story that ends up growing. It moves also into the non-Jewish mainstream. And then sort of two things. Once you hit the 20th century, sort of two things happen at basically the same time, which I find really interesting. So one of them is that, I'm going to go back to what you were talking about earlier, because I thought it was really interesting. We're talking about non-Jews and the golem story, and could it sort of pervert it into anti-Semitic twists. So there's a book called The Golem that was written by Gustavus Meyrink, and by then, for nearly a century, this is about he puts out the book in the early 1910s, but he'd apparently been writing it for a few years at that point, so it's really contemporaneous with the other story that's come out, which is very different. So he writes this novel, and the golem isn't even a character. It's not a classic golem story like anything that we've described, actually. It's this malignant force. So the story is set in the Prague ghetto. It's written by a non-Jewish man, a non-Jewish man who'd had a bit of a psychological episode that had led him to become fascinated by Jewish mysticism in some way. And I haven't read it. I haven't track down a copy, but I did watch the movie, which was based on it, which is interesting in and of itself. And he writes this book. It's really about Jews in Prague, and this man, he puts on a different man's hat, and it turns him into that person from 30 years ago. But the most important theme in the book, in terms of the golem, is that every 33 years, the golem returns to wreak havoc in the ghetto of Prague, because the golem is kind of an essence of the spirit of the city. And it's the first time you see really a golem as an inherently malicious figure. And it's not really present in the same way as others. We don't hear about it being used so much. Maharal is also, and then, the Maharal did create it, but none of this is like a very strong theme in the book. But there's definitely a lot of themes in it that just seem a bit icky. The golem is it's the first time the golem is evil, for example. And then we get to this movie that was really popular at the time. It was to this day, I think it has 100, it's like it went rated, 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. People really hold it very highly. And if you watch it, you can kind of see why. It's very trippy and interesting. I kind of loved it. It's directed by this guy named Paul Wegener. He actually made 3 movies based on this book, and this is one of them, and it's sort of a fictionalization of the story of how Maharal created the golem. And the thing is, you look at these people, the characters that he creates. The story, first of all, it's mostly based on the Rabbi Elijah Chalm version, the Wiesel version, with a little bit as well of what we'll talk about in a minute, in terms of the Rosenberg version, where the golem helps protect against a fate that will affect the Jewish community. But the most significant thing, I think, from what you were asking earlier, is that the storyline, first of all, adds a lot of mystic mumbo-jumbo that you will never find in a lot of the Jewish versions of the story that makes no sense. At least Yudel Rosenberg, when he does his story, he includes a lot of mysticism, but it's all stuff that, because he's a rabbi, makes internal sense. The fact that, so it does include certain things that just don't make sense in terms of, Judaism and Jewish mysticism, but, it's a movie, and the movie never gets it exactly right. But also, the Jews are caricatures, and they're all, like, little and wizened and sort of creepy looking, whereas the non-Jews are all, tall and noble and, incidentally, Aryan. This movie was made in Germany. It was pre-Nazis, but the guy who made it then went on to make the movie of a book called Yud Sus, which is about Jewish, high elite from the 18th century, who was then later hanged, and it's a movie that ends up being pretty symbolic in the Nazi era of the evil of Jews. This is someone who we can just imagine coming into the picture without the intention of making a movie that portrays Jews very well, and is perfectly happy to have this be a movie that makes Jews seem kind of weird and creepy and mystical for the sake of, this very artistic, interesting looking movie that I do actually recommend. I found it on YouTube. I do actually recommend checking it out. But it's definitely just a really interesting adaptation, which does show the influence of non-Jews on the narrative, and that it can have, because, everything we've been talking about, there is so much, obviously, creative potential within it in terms of creating something else. And, we alluded to earlier, it's something where golems as, figures in sci-fi, fantasy, whatever, come throughout, 20th and later 21st centuries. He was just one of the earlier ones to do it in a non-text medium. But at the same time, he definitely was not approaching this in a, sympathetic manner towards the Jews he was creating the story about. So that I definitely found to be very interesting. But the one that I find more interesting for me personally, partly because I know a bunch of his descendants, so I find that to be very cool, but he just is an extremely interesting person. So there's the version by Yudel Rosenberg. So I don't know if anyone has ever heard the story of a golem told as follows, in which Maharal creates a golem because there is a blood libel in Prague in the late 16th century. And so he creates this golem out of clay, and he calls it Yasala, the name Yosef with the nickname Yasala. Yasala does different things for him, but his main role is to protect the Jewish community from any kind of harm, particularly from people who are inciting blood libels against the Jews. So that is a version a lot of people have heard, as I kind of mentioned earlier, and that was entirely made up by a man named Yudel Rosenberg, who I've alluded to multiple times up until now, and now I'll finally talk a little bit more about him and his version. He was born in 1859 in Russian Poland. To the best of my knowledge, he never set foot in Prague. He probably knew nothing about it, and he definitely knew nothing about what it was like at the time in which he was writing about it. He was the rabbi of several towns, as well as Warsaw, and he was very interested in mysticism. He translated parts of Zohar, which is a core book of Jewish mysticism. And he also produced a lot of what I would call, and honestly what he would call, creative literature. But because at the time that he was writing, it wasn't particularly befitting a rabbi to write fiction, he simply framed it as though it was not fiction. So he wrote several books particularly about Maharal, but also about several other rabbinic figures, in which he would compile stories about them. And there were a lot of different kinds of them. So I mentioned forgery and plagiarism sort of being themes that come along here. Yudel Rosenberg, if you ask members of his family, I don't think they would ever say, oh, he was a plagiarist, because, you have family pride, and he was truly a very intelligent person. He was well respected as a rabbi. He ended up emigrating to Canada, and he died one of the leading rabbis of Montreal with, great respect given to him. He seems to have been a very cool person in his lifetime. He has, I think he had 10 children, and he has many descendants, including the Montreal author Mordecai Richler, a member of the Israeli parliament from a few decades ago, a bunch of rabbis to this day. So he, was a distinguished figure in his own right from that perspective. But he also was somebody who wrote things that he portrayed as being what they were not. And to a certain degree, he did not necessarily have a problem admitting this later on, but when he did write it, he portrayed these things as being true, and a lot of people took it very literally. So in this particular case, I actually because we're going to focus more on the golem part later, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about something else I wrote, because I find it very interesting. So one thing that we know about him is that he wrote in Russian. He read Russian. So he read Hebrew, Yiddish, possibly other languages, I don't know, but he read Russian. So he was reading a lot of, Russian literature, which sort of broadened his horizons in terms of different things. And we know that he was reading detective novels by Arthur Conan Doyle. How do we know this? Because he wrote a book about Maharal called, and which was basically adapted, would be the neutral term, but very heavily adapted from a short story called The Jew's Breastplate by Arthur Conan Doyle. And he adapted the storyline to the story to have Maharal be the key character instead of Arthur Conan Doyle's key character. The difference being Arthur Conan Doyle's version occurred in the 19th century and Maharal lived in the 16th century. And so there are definitely a lot of different things about it that don't entirely come across as historically plausible, but it was quite popular in its time. He did very well, and it's because he was in some ways providing at a time when among the religious community in Europe, like more religiously, spiritually strict Jews, reading fiction could often be seen as kind of transgressive or trashy in particular ways. So he was writing something that was kind of kosher, so to speak, in terms of being able to read that. But part of it being kosher is the insinuation that it's true. So there's this kind of a middle ground that I think is a little bit interesting. But
so this is something that might be even a little bit of a nudge, wink, wink. Yes, it's true situation, except some people then actually very much take it literally.
Yes, so this one I think less so. I don't really know exactly how it was received in terms of what people thought of it. I think people probably trusted him because by then he'd already written this other thing, about the golem. I do know there's a scholar who published, so his synagogue in Montreal, this is decades later in the early 1930s, honored him at a dinner, and they did a whole list of the books that he'd written. just on the brochure or the invitation or whatever it was, and it listed it under, works of Jewish law, and then different categories, and then works of fiction. And all these different kinds of things ended up on there, and he seemed to have no problem with it. So clearly this is something where he was using it as an outlet, but at the same time, and it also is a little bit more complicated because he did write a book. He wrote a Haggadah, or a sort of a ritual book for the Seder on Passover. And he said it was from the Maharal, but while some of it was, he said that so one of his big things was that he didn't, for a lot of what he wrote, not all of it, he didn't just claim that this was an authentic manuscript. He claimed it was an authentic manuscript from the library in Metz, in France, that he got from a distant relative of his named Chaim Sharfstein, who found it there and sold it to him.
So this is a really complicated
framing device. And if you read the book is called Niflos HaMaharal, The Miracles of the Maharal. And if you read it, it is framed by documents that he received. First, there's the saying, "This is where I got it from my distant cousin Chaim Sharfstein." And then it includes a whole prologue, includes a whole prologue from the son-in-law of Maharal. And he claimed that he wrote this whole fake prologue about how this book is authentic. So it's not just a matter of, I am going to write a book and pretend it's true. He created the sort of meta narrative around it as well, sort of in the way like The Princess Bride, where
I was just thinking of The Princess Bride.
The story of The Princess Bride, and then you have the fake William Goldman, trying to find the book for his son, because they're having marital problems. He and his wife are having marital problems. It's the same sort of a thing where he's creating both the narrative and the meta-narrative. And the meta-narrative, the difference being, I don't know how much William Goldman expected to fool readers. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I know he did fool a lot of people who, didn't necessarily know the details of his biography. But at the same time, this is something where he does seem, to a certain degree, to have tried to couch this as something that could have been real, that he really did find. So it turns very interesting from that perspective. So one thing, though, that I think beyond that makes this particular version very interesting is what it adds to the Golem legend, because those are things that really pop up a lot later on. So he's the first person who doesn't have, in fact, he has the Maharal forbid the golem from being used for household chores, except in very specific circumstances, partly because when he would try to do the household chores, he would be very Amelia Bedelia about it. So, for example, there's one story, there's the classic, Sorcerer's Apprentice type story where he's told to bring in water and he brings in so much he floods the house. There's another one that I find even funnier where he tells Yussel of the golem to go fishing, and he goes to go fishing and he draws all this and he's late coming back, and by then they've already gotten fish somewhere else, so they send someone to say, "Hey, Yussela, you don't have to stay out so long to fill up your sack." They say, "Fill up this sack with fish." And you say, "Oh, you don't have to fill up the sack of fish. We already have. We don't really need it." So he says, "Oh, okay." And then he dumps out the sack, the half the sack that he's already caught, goes back with no fish. So after that, they're a little bit like, okay, so let's just use him only for important things. And the important things are the service of the community. And that actually involves a lot of different things. He disguises himself as a Christian peasant to sort of lurk around and catch any Christians around Passover time who would try to, if you believe Yiddel Rosenberg's version, people would do this all the time, plant dead bodies of Christian children in Jewish homes in order to claim that they were using the blood for the Passover matzahs, the unleavened bread. So this is something, there are actually 3 or 4 separate stories of this happening in the story, as well as a bunch of other different things where Yussela gets to use talents that he has, such as being able to see, bring back the dead to talk to them, or see dead bodies that are above their graves. And he's also the version of the golem who can actually be injured, and he looks like a normal person. That's one of the main things. So this Flo's Maharal, his book, really is kind of, it's sort of like a Mark Twain kind of a narrative. For all we know, he Theodore Rosenberg could have even read Mark Twain, in which there are lots of different short stories, but they kind of end up interconnecting into a narrative. And so the surrounding narrative is, the Jewish struggle against these blood libels. And one important thing to know, how do we know that there is no chance any of this really happened, is because at the time period in which Maharal lived in Prague, it was one of the most peaceful times for Jews in the history of that city. A lot of scholars consider it essentially a golden age. We don't know of any blood libels happened at the time. We know of plenty that happened before. We know plenty that happened after. We know plenty that happened at that time in other cities. We don't know of any that happened at that time in Prague in the lifetime of the Maharal. What we do know, though, is that right around when Theodore Rosenberg was writing this, there were actually a lot of blood libel stories. There were pogroms as well that were happening. This is something that was very much a part of the reality that he was living in. He was in Russian Poland, and this was a very sketchy and dangerous period for many Jews who were living in Tsarist Russia at that point. A few years later would come the Mendel-Beilis trial, which is one of the most famous blood libel trials to have ever happened. And so he is actually superimposing the chaotic, unlike, sometimes you would envision this kind of thing where you go back in history and you imagine it being worse than it was. So he does this, but instead of it just being like, oh, history was bad, he's saying, oh, that history was just as bad as it is now. It's really, for him, the present is bad, and he's putting that into the past. But there's an almost fantasy element, because in that narrative that he has, the police are going to be there to fix things. There's justice. People go on trial and they get a fair trial. The king and the other different people who are responsible for justice care about justice being done. And that's not something that he felt that he had access to, or that his community had access to in Russia at that time. So he was sort of creating a fantasy. The fantasy he was creating in this sense was one in which if someone is going to do something evil to the Jewish community, not only is there a great golem to save the day and catch the person who's doing it, also that person will be brought to justice. If a Jew is put on trial for something they didn't do, they will be exonerated and they will be freed. And so the whole story ends, and it leads to Yasala being decommissioned, when King Rudolph in the story is said to have disallowed anyone from claiming that Jews did a blood libel, that it was empirically false and you could not bring that kind of a claim. So this is the kind of thing where it's not just a fantasy of having a big hulking clay man to save the day, but also a justice system in which people actually would be responsive to Jews and their suffering and the way in which they were being persecuted, which was just as fantastical for him as the idea of this kind of a golem.
It really sounds, it's funny, earlier on you mentioned, Superman and that kind of thing, but like, isn't that the superhero kind of thing? You have this thing with powers, or this person with powers or whatever, saving the day, and you have this great happy ending where everything turns out wonderful, and all of the evils are purged, and everything is great. It's one of those. It's not just superheroes; just about everywhere. It has their kind of their happily ever after. But it's an interesting. You're saying it's a sort of a, wish fulfillment idea from essentially from his life to say that this is trying to create a happy ending to a problem that obviously then, did not have a happy ending, and unfortunately would not have a happy ending.
Yeah, it definitely, absolutely is. It's interesting, I mentioned the Mendel-Beilis trial. That one actually, it did go to trial, and he was acquitted, but that was something that people had no idea whether that would be possible. It was an extremely tense time around the world. Lots of people, and there had been a lot of other cases that would have stuck in his mind. For example, in Damascus, in I believe 1840, there was a case of a blood libel in which Jews died from being tortured under suspicion of using blood from a Christian, from a priest, and I believe also a small boy for Passover matzos, and there have been plenty of others at that time. There was even one in New York in the mid-19th century that was in upstate New York that was United States, as far as I'm aware, first and last blood libel. The child who disappeared was actually found later on, alive and well, lost in the woods. But for a brief time, people automatically assumed that the local Jews had killed her to make matzah. And so this was absolutely something that Jews knew could happen. They could not always know to expect it. And you mentioned the thing, I alluded to earlier in terms of comics, and there are a lot of people who will draw these kinds of connections. I mean, I think the idea that Superman has different kinds of origins in Jewish folk, Jewish traditions that maybe the creators were thinking of is, I think, a relatively common one. So for example, Superman being sent to Earth, people make the parallel, I think, to like Moses on the Nile, but they'll also, in the one book I read, they make it to the sort of the Kindertransport that was happening at around that time, where Jews were sending their children from Nazi-controlled Europe to England in order to hopefully keep them safe. And there is actually, Will Eisner, who is a cartoonist who I think there's a major award in comics that is named after him, and he actually specifically called out the Golem as a precursor for the superhero, because the way he describes it, in every society there's a need for mythological characters, wish fulfillment, and the wish fulfillment in the Jewish case of the hero would be someone who could protect us. And this kind of storytelling seems to dominate in Jewish culture, and there are, later on, particularly after the Holocaust, I think that's something that became really relevant. I think that's one of the reasons why, because people did, Rosenberg's version of the story became super popular. Not only did it become really popular, for someone who was plagiarizing other people's works or borrowing liberally from them, he was plagiarized immediately. People were selling off-brand versions. Another guy basically rewrote his entire story as his own and published it under his own name and did a whole press tour in the United States claiming that he'd written it. So he actually didn't make a whole lot of money from it, but other people made a lot of money from it. So, it all kind of comes around. But this became such a popular story, and it achieved such folkloric status in people's minds because they knew that there was a pre-existing idea of golems, and all of a sudden they have this thing being presented as accurate that has this motif of, the golem saving the Jews. And, they seized on it. So there are definitely traces of that in a lot of, especially post-Holocaust, a time when people, will fantasize about something that could have come, to save the Jews from destruction, which is obviously a theme in a lot of Jewish people's minds. The golem would absolutely be the sort of thing that would not just be part of the culture as, a big a potentially destructive force or something that can come out of control, something that can be controlled, something that is benevolent. Rosenberg's golem is a benevolent creature. It's one that is specifically trying to go out its way to be helpful to the Jewish community. And also, in addition to that, is really an instrument of justice, and not just in and of itself, but also as part of a just world in which what the golem does is only part of a greater system of justice that is systemic within that world. The police and the rulers will all look out for you just as much as the golem will. It's actually interesting because in the context of Conan Doyle, that was one of those things because I happen to be really into murder mysteries lately, just reading them a lot. That's another thing where I'm wondering in the golem stories where he has the police and the courts and all that. I wonder if he'd been reading a lot of mystery novels, because that was a very relatively new phenomenon at that point. That was being written, and I'm curious to what extent he borrowed from those kinds of narratives in terms of the way that he wrote about different kinds of police cases and court cases and finding out murderers. So that's another kind of influence I think that they might have had on him. And then, of course, he had a tremendous impact culturally on a lot of creative works. Adventures of with books, amazing. I think it's called The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. There are a bunch of different, and then of course in different, as I mentioned, sci-fi, fantasy universes. The idea of a golem, which can either be the sorcerer's apprentice out of control type or the savior type. I've seen examples of both. And so that's why I find really interesting. There's at least one, Israeli academic who claims that Yudel Rosenberg is the 20th century Jewish author who most influenced general world culture. And I think that there is definitely a case to be made for that if you separate it from him personally, and given that no one's really heard of him, and instead look at like the sort of ripple effects that his ideas and his work had on other things that ended up becoming very, very popular.
To the point that, as you were saying earlier, and I would love to go to Prague. I someday hope to get there, but I will look out for the. I take it you can go to like souvenir shops and get yourself a golem and that kind of stuff.
Everything is golems. I've never been either. I would like to go at some point, but I see pictures all the time from people who go. They post. The Jewish community also has seized on it a little bit because at a certain point you kind of have to. It's just part of it. But it's absolutely a major, major bit of it. And so it's really just golem world, and rather than recognizing a genuinely, Prague is the home of the Altneuschule, which I mentioned. People only remember it because the ruins of Yesala Golem, or the Golem of Prague, because this legend existed before Yesala. Say that that people remember because he's in the attic, but it's the oldest surviving synagogue in Europe, which is pretty crazy. It's from the 13th century. It has a very old Jewish community, a very well-established one. It had Maharal, who was a leading figure of his day. It had several other leading and esteemed rabbis over time, different people who became very significant. And so it's kind of a shame in some ways that the golem, especially since the only really reason why they don't know 100% why the golem ever became associated with Prague. They just kind of assume that different local versions of the story populated over time, and then this one is just the one that gained steam. But no one really knows why it became associated that way, but it just did, and it's not going away anytime soon, and it's created kind of things that are bigger than the sum of their parts, that are culturally really interesting, culturally influential and impactful. And so it just is how it is now. And I find it particularly ironic given the number of people who wrote about it, and people significant like Yudel Rosenberg who wrote about it, who never had never been to Prague themselves, have no connection to Prague, and yet they've now, in many ways, put it on the map.
So I wanted to ask about the Maharal and kind of his part in all this, because you've mentioned that kind of Prague has gotten overrun by this concept of the golem, and that the golem is the, this defining feature, which really wasn't, and really isn't historical and all that kind of thing. But Maharal is, as I understand it, is very well known, especially in kind of scholarly circles, figure. And I'd imagine there are a lot of scholars who get kind of annoyed at this as well, that this is the popular understanding of his life, is this thing that is based entirely in fiction.
Yeah, I definitely, it's an interesting sort of double-edged sword. On the one hand, Maharal was a fascinating figure. He probably never would have been as well known as, let's say, a rabbi like Maimonides, who, if you've ever heard of a rabbi contemporary era, it's probably, you've heard of someone like him, where that was never going to be him. He would probably have been among many other rabbinic figures where he was a genuinely great figure of his time, but and also a genuinely great figure within the world of Judaism, but not someone who anyone outside that would have heard of. He's a genuinely interesting person. He was interested in mysticism, though not practical mysticism. He had an approach where he was trying to integrate it within a more, and also partly in sort of opposition to a more like rationalistic approach of Judaism that was at the time that was popular at his time. So that was a very important part of his theology. He wanted to kind of make sure that the mystical and the spiritual wouldn't get erased by rationalism. He was very well educated, mostly self-educated in science, in philosophy, and lots of different other kinds of contemporary science and knowledge. In his time, he corresponded with different figures. He's known to have directed some of his students to teach Hebrew, even to non-Jews, Christian Hebraists. So it's one of these very interesting kinds of things where he's a fascinating figure. Probably no one would have ever heard of him otherwise outside of this kind of Jewish world, where he is a well-known figure. You know, I would have learned about him regardless in school. Scholars in a, yeshiva, a center of Jewish learning, would have absolutely heard of him. Scholars in Jewish academia would have absolutely heard of him regardless. Not many other people probably would have. But here, he has the issue where now he's as famous as he could have ever probably wanted to be, if he ever wanted to be at all. But if he ever did want to be famous, it probably wasn't for something that he never did, and that was probably antithetical to the kinds of things that he would have done in his life, that someone imposed upon him. So it's one of those sort of double-edged swords. You know, there's a statue of him now in Prague that may never have gone up if not for the fact that he became associated with a golem that he definitely never made. If there's anyone, so that's, in a sense, it's kind of two separate worlds. So the people who know of Maharal as Maharal, they're not even necessarily thinking about the golem all that much because it wasn't part of his life. There is a sort of a Venn diagram, though, in the middle, and that's I alluded to a little bit earlier. There are some religious Jews who do believe that this is a thing that absolutely happened. I know when I was first exposed to this story, it's supposed as a children's story, but there's a kind of a culture of, great rabbis. They don't tell such stories about me and you, is the way that a lot of people will conceptualize it. Like, they're not, this rabbi might not have done it, but he could have done it. It's what I was alluding to very early on when I was talking about the prehistory of the golem. The point of the story is to show the powers of these rabbis. So the idea being, historically speaking, did he make the golem? But clearly he was a great rabbi with great knowledge and all these other kinds of things. So to believe that he couldn't have done it, or that he didn't do it, to some people is almost the same thing. And there's also one particular rabbi who claimed from about a century ago, who claimed that he had seen the ruins of the golem, and so many of his followers now will continue to make that claim. So it's definitely an interesting kind of thing. I think it's more those people in the middle of that Venn diagram, the people who both see him as an important rabbinic figure, and the people who also see this as a main facet of their knowledge of Maharal at the same time, who really get people's goats at a certain stage, or who are the most interesting. That's a lot more interesting, though, again, than just the fact that this person who you greatly admire, or who you study and find fascinating, is also seen as this sort of a grand rabbi sorcerer figure by a whole group of other people who you don't necessarily think about all that much.
So this is entirely, in many ways, doesn't matter in this whole thing. But Maharal wrote and all this kind of stuff. Did he have any concept of a golem? Did he write down anything about a golem? Was there ever anything from his pen?
Nothing that I'm aware of. Nothing that I've ever read has indicated it. I'm pretty sure I've read definitive statements, no, that he didn't. But I wouldn't swear to it, but I definitely never have read anything. And he would have known what it was, absolutely, the same way that anyone else would at that time, as a mystical concept, as I was mentioning, particularly since he did study mysticism, just in a much more theoretical and spiritual sense, rather than in the kind of practical sense where you're using holy names and different kinds of formulas and stuff like that in order to try to actually create things. But there is no evidence in his writings. Also, and this is a little bit different because it's more about Gil Rosenberg's version of the story versus just the idea of him being associated, which, as we've seen, came earlier than Gil Rosenberg. But a lot of the other historical things that he brings in don't really jive up either. Like, for example, we have no knowledge of any interaction between Maharal and King Rudolph in Prague, and some of the people who he names just were not people who existed. But even on the most basic level of many of the versions of the story, starting in 1832, that Maharal had any association with the golem is just not something that we really see any knowledge of in this context.
Well, this has been, fascinating. I find it so interesting how these kinds of stories, change and adapt, and as you say, all of the kind of the children and grandchildren of this story, coming out in so many different ways. Unless there's anything else that you're, particularly interested in adding. I
think that was everything that I had planned to mention. I will say, I didn't focus so much on the really contemporary kinds of things, just I'm not so familiar with it. Like, I haven't read a lot of more recent works. Like, there are some works by Jewish authors, such as Michael Chabon, that have incorporated golems. There's also, as mentioned, a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, a lot of fantasy books. Like, besides for Discworld, that's really the only thing that I've seen. So I'm curious. Like, I don't know if people will have, if they are reading these kinds of things, or if they are seeing these kinds of things. For example, I'm pretty sure there are golem characters in like role player games and different things like that. You can kind of trace back which character traits come from which version. Like, what do people know about? What do people not know about? So that's always the kind of thing I find very interesting. So, you can look out for that and kind of trace back the lineage. I've had a lot of fun doing that with in Discworld and Feet of Clay. I guess that's really the one thing that I didn't address quite as much, because it's just not something I'm necessarily as familiar with, as not a necessarily big fantasy person or a big, modern literary fiction person. But if anyone does happen to have seen that, you can kind of reflect back, trace back, where did these different character traits, because people won't just say, oh, I read Yudel Rosenberg, and so my golem is now a big savior who saves, the day in my version. There are a lot, because all these different kinds of generations of the golem story kind of merged in collective consciousness until it became the golem myth or the golem legend without really any sense of the stratifications of it. People will sort of pick and choose and mix and match all the different traits. So you'll have a golem who saves the day, but is also a sorcerer's apprentice type, and it can also go out of control. And if there's one thing that Yussela the golem never did, it was go out of control. He was always, he was a completely beneficent figure, except for in that sorcerer's apprentice kind of a way. So you'll have a golem who is really who is a savior, but who has MS written on his forehead, and you have to erase the Aleph. So there are lots of different ways in which all different versions of this legend are kind of mixed and matched, because instead of seeing it in this kind of where did it come from, which versions were there, it's kind of all merged, as though all of them are kind of equal and similar and part of the same legend, even though, as we've seen, they're created in completely different kinds of things, and not even always reacting off of each other, but sometimes just creating entirely new things out of, the author's imagination, and creating entirely new, from entirely new contexts that wouldn't have previously existed for other versions. So I think that that's something where, if people are encountering golems, if people are clicking on this episode because they're sci-fi fantasy fans and they've heard of a golem and turn some kind of a role player game, and they might notice hints and bits and pieces of the golems that they're familiar with in multiple of the different versions of the tales that I'm saying. So I find that to be a really interesting thing.
And there's even, as you say, you can even find out there instructions to make your own if you so feel.
Yeah, on my original thread that I did about it on AskHistorians, I actually copy-pasted a bit from Moshe Idel. Moshe Idel has a book called, I forget what it's actually called Golem, and it specifically goes into the Kabbalistic angle. And I included a snippet of it, and it is genuinely impossible to understand. It's not even about reading Hebrew. I read Hebrew. It does not help. It is just absolutely obscure and opaque, and purposely so, because mysticism in Judaism is considered something that only the wisest and most learned are supposed to encounter, something only. There's a lot of people say you have to be 40 years old in order to even start to attempt it. So this is written in but in theory, the recipe really is out there and in a bunch of different sources. And so, go ahead, have fun, as long as you're 40.
There you go. There you go. I'll have to wait a few years for that, but but we'll maybe I'll try. Well, HannahStoHelit, moderator at Ask Historians, a flair. If you've got any golem questions, feel free to ask them on Ask Historians, and she'll get right to it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tyler. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast, and we'll see you in a couple weeks for the next episode.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.